Hey, I'll bring you. Okay. Yeah. All right, thanks everybody. How's everybody doing so far? You guys hanging in there? Yeah. That was raucous. So our next presenter happens to be another presidential fellow here at UGA. He also happens to be my good friend and my great drinking buddy, Doug Merchant.
Thank you very much. Am I great at drinking, or am I a great drinking buddy?
Well,
Is it both? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just trying to picture the derivation there. Okay, so this comes from a paper I wrote for a morphology class a couple years ago. I've updated it a little bit and sort of turned it into something that looks like a conference presentation. But what I'm going to be talking about is the differences between language production and language comprehension, which to some of you it might seem rather obvious that these are different processes. Certainly if you're a phonetician, you're quite accustomed to thinking in terms of perception versus articulation. But in a lot of theoretical work, especially in morphology and syntax, it's rarely made explicit whether a model is talking about production or comprehension. And I think sort of there's a lot of confusion that comes out of that. And then I'm also going to be looking just briefly at distributed morphology, the model of distributed morphology, which I think makes a certain amount of sense as a model of language production, but very little sense, I think, as a model of language comprehension. I'll be pulling in some psycholinguistic evidence on that. So first, this is how a chicken becomes a chicken. It hatches out of an egg. This is how a house, at least a brick house, becomes a house. It's put together brick by brick with mortar. And this is how a chicken becomes not a chicken. And I apologize to any vegetarians, vegans, if this is horrifying to you. We take it apart by its joints with a knife. Very different process from a chicken hatching out of an egg. And this is how a house becomes not a house. We get a bulldozer, we knock it down, some of the bricks break, it comes apart in pieces. Pretty different process. So a lot of theoretical work depends on sort of an implicit assumption that the derivation underlying the production of an utterance and the comprehension of that utterance are basically isomorphic or identically structured, except that you have reverse directionality, right? It's coming in instead of going out, but everything works the same way in reverse. So that's sort of an implicit assumption that you see a lot. But for most systems in nature, the process by which something is put together, so the output function, is really fundamentally different from the process by which it's broken down. So there's really no reason why language should necessarily be any different. The modularity of comprehension. New twist on an old classic, colorless yellow derivations pillage peacefully. Just so that we're seeing it with fresh eyes. And then one of my own, I guess, the pasta was by the dog eaten. So the fact that we're able to use our tacit knowledge of English grammar to build some kind of a structure for number one, and that we're able to figure out what happened to our pasta in number two suggests that, first of all, comprehension is modular. So syntax and semantics are functionally independent in the domain of comprehension. And also that we're able to make use of more general cognitive processes to understand language that comes in a form that we wouldn't produce ourselves. So native speakers of English would never say the pasta was by the dog eaten, but we're able to rearrange that sentence in our head or something, or just look at the semantic roles of what's going on there and make assumptions about whether the pasta eats the dog or the dog eats the pasta. We can figure out what's going on. Production may well be non-modular. So note that, the generative capacity of the grammar allows for number one. We can produce that structure, we can generate it. And the conceptual intentional system allows for two. In other words, it's totally possible to have, like the pasta and was by the dog and eaten. Such sentences are non-existent in at least L1 language behavior. So in the domain of language production, syntax and semantics may be undisentangleable. They're quite clearly, I think, disentangleable in the domain of comprehension. So now some comprehension-specific processing constraints. Another famous sentence, take a moment and read it in case you've never seen it before. What's happening to the horse? What happened to the horse here?
He fell.
Well, he fell after
Being
raced
raced
around the barn. Raced past the barn. So here we see, this sentence should be a lot easier to read. The horse which was raced past the barn fell. So this is, the horse raced past the barn fell is a reduced object relative passive clause, and it's temporarily ambiguous with a simple active clause. The horse raced past the barn. So these two are structurally identical, and so equally easy to generate from the perspective of production. But 3A is far more difficult to comprehend because of this temporary ambiguity. And note also that utterances are only ever ambiguous in comprehension, right? In production, the proposition that you want to express is already a given, and you just have to translate it into some kind of syntactic structure. But in comprehension, competition between structures and therefore propositions is possible. So we say a sentence like, I saw the man with the telescope. We say that's ambiguous. It's only ambiguous when you're reading it or when you're hearing it, right? It's never ambiguous when you're thinking it. You're always either thinking, I used a telescope to see the man, or I saw a man carrying a telescope. It's never ambiguous in comprehension. In production. I think I'm going to skip this slide, but just note that there's two different structures. The first structure that's built is the horse raced past the barn. It's attached under the S node, and then you get to fell and realize that can't be right, and then you go back and you attach it correctly as a reduced relative clause. And then something I really like centrally embedded sentences, because they're the kind of sentence that you show them to somebody and they will absolutely insist to you that it's complete nonsense, completely ungrammatical. However, birds, cats, fleas, bite, chase, fly is actually a grammatical sentence of English. Let's look at it like this. The birds which the cats that fleas, bite, chase, fly. So which the cats that fleas, bite, chase, again, is a relative clause attached to birds, and the birds are doing the flying. There it is with the brackets, if that helps at all. So note that these two are completely structurally identical. So we have birds, cats, fleas, bite, chase, fly. And the birds which the cats that fleas, bite, chase, fly. So structurally identical. So as with garden paths, the greater processing difficulty can't be explained in terms of more complex structure. But here the problem is not ambiguity, the problem is with building a structure at all. And it's also not that multiple embeddings, like we're seeing here, are so hard to parse that we just need the complementizers and determiners. This isn't always the case. So it's obvious boys like dogs they play with is not really much harder than it's obvious that the boys like the dogs that they play with. So the problem is that cats in this sentence is both the agent of chase and the patient of bite. Birds is both the agent of fly and the patient of chase. So fleas bite cats, cats chase birds, birds fly is basically what this sentence means. So there's a perceptual constraint going on here, which I would argue is superordinate to language. When a stimulus is analyzed as serving a double function, so cats being both the patient of bite and the agent of chase, the result is an increased cognitive load in a sense of this is impossible. So anything by M.C. Escher, this is the same principle he uses. And we actually have a visual analog here in which y is serving a double function. It's either part of this curved structure over here by x, or it's part of this straight structure over here by z. And it can't serve both functions. So this becomes very difficult. So in 4b, which is the birds, which the cats that the fleas bite, chase, etc., there's enough extra information that parser is able to sort of build a structure by brute force. But it's still not a great sentence. Okay, so now some group differences in processing heuristics. There are many of these. along many different variables, sex, certain personality traits, obviously L1, L2 status. But the one I'm going to talk about briefly today is familial handedness, which is the presence or absence of left-handers in one's family. So right-handers with left-handed family members, which are referred to as familial sinistrals, from sinister from meaning left, or FS plus, seem to initially emphasize semantic processing over grammatical processing. Right-handers without left-handed relatives seem to initially emphasize the building of grammatical structures. So overall language proficiency, 5 minutes left?
Until question time.
Okay, wow. Yeah, this is way too long. Okay, so overall proficiency is comparable, but different heuristics may be involved. So very briefly, FS plus have a greater initial reliance on semantic processing, FS minus a greater initial reliance on grammatical processing. I'm going to have to be selective about the slides I show. Okay, so this is just one example of a study. So this was a phrasal decision task. Is this a meaningful phrase in English? And of course, there were many different kinds of phrases that were meaningful grammatical and unmeaningful agrammatical and so forth. But I found, this is work I did in Arizona. I found a real distinction between those who have left-handers in their family and those who don't. Basically like FS minus, they rejected these phrases like kicks a buckets in which there's a morphosyntactic conflict, or eat this pears, a full 81% of the time. And again, this was a time task. It was do this as fast as you can, which is why it wasn't 100%. FS plus only 70% of the time, and those who had first degree left-hand relatives, so a parent or sibling, only about 67% of the time. So this shows a significant tendency for them to more quickly access the semantic representations of words, with FS minus much more attuned to grammatical information, so morphosyntactic conflicts. So the evidence of different heuristics between different groups, who nonetheless showed similar patterns of language production, suggests there's a dissociation between the generative productive capacity, which I think might be largely identical across the species, and the processing comprehension capacity, which might vary between individual brains. Neighborhood density effects on lexical access. So this is the number of lexemes differing from the target lexeme by only one phoneme. So cat has something like 35 neighbors. Dog has about 8, although it probably depends on whether you have a caught merger. The word again has none unless you pronounce it as again, in which it has gain. So in production studies, high neighborhood density improves speed and accuracy. In comprehension studies, we find the opposite result. So words from high density neighborhoods are produced faster than those from low density neighborhoods. In lexical decision tasks, on the other hand, high density is associated with poorer performance, both speed and accuracy. So we have a disconnect here. High neighborhood density has different effects on production and comprehension tasks. And I'll skip that. We also have asymmetries and acquisition. So L2 learners are able to understand more words than they produce. The same thing with young children at the age of 13 months understand about 50 words, produce about 10. And this was a study in which they made up words and tried to get people to memorize them, children and adults. And you see in both cases, comprehension is outstripping production. I think I'll just have to skip this. All right, so distributed morphology, a couple of basics about it. Syntactic structure all the way down, morphemes combined in the syntax. Late insertion, phonological forms only associated, only inserted after the syntax is complete. And that's when irregular inflections are dealt with. And also acategorial roots. Roots have no inherent category. Evidence for distributed morphology as a model of production comes from anomic aphasia and tip of the tongue state. So this is when you can't think of a word, you know what it means, but you just cannot think of how to say the word. So distributed morphology is actually well positioned to explain this if the phonological form is stored separately from the root and you can't connect the root with the morphology. So this was a study done in which they elicited tip of the tongue states, gave them definitions, they had to provide the word. And if they couldn't think of the word, they might have been in a tip of the tongue state. So they'd give them these contexts. There is blank or there is a blank. There won't be many blank or there won't be much blank. And they'd be like, well, which context would it go in? Many or much? Which would it go with? Then they were shown the word. So they were significantly more successful if they were in a tip of the tongue state and choosing the correct context. Basically, this is looking at whether or not count versus mass noun features are available in the absence of phonological retrieval. So this suggests that distributed morphology might be right about feature bundles being stored separately from their PFs. And I'll have to skip that one, and then I'll just do one of these as a model of comprehension. So DM proposes that even irregular forms inflect through affixation. So the syntax attaches a past affix to a root. Only in the phonology is there stipulation that it inflects irregularly. Then there's a readjustment rule and it produces the correct form. So it looks something like this. You have this root meaning bring. It doesn't actually sound like bring yet, but there's a root that means bring. Then there's a past affix. And then you have this sort of intermediate form, which would be something like brinked. And then there's the stipulation in the phonology saying that actually it's pronounced brought. So the prediction is that these regular and irregular verbs would be accessed the same way via decomposition into root and affix, but there have been many studies over the years demonstrating dissociations between regular and irregular processing. So this was a priming study. Present tense forms would be primed by either their past tense form or their present tense form. This was repetition priming. So either jumped or jump would prime jump. Hung or hang would prime hang. And what they found is that jump primes jump very well. Jumped also primes jumped very well. Hang primes hang, but hung does not prime hang. So the idea here is that since it's an irregular past tense form, it has its own lexical entry, and so it's not priming itself like all the other forms are. So irregular and regular verbs are processed differently. And I think I'm probably going to have to skip some of this. Get to my conclusion, which has to do with chickens again. So this does not bode well, this evidence from irregular verb processing and the other evidence that I didn't have time to show you, does not bode well for distributed morphology as a model of language comprehension. But if production and comprehension are functionally independent systems, then maybe it is an appropriate model for how we produce it, but not how we comprehend it. So it models the output function, not the input function. So just the moral of the story is, you know, when somebody's talking about their model of the grammar to you, and they say it accounts for more of the data than another one, you know, ask them whether they're talking about the output function or the input function, production or comprehension, because you don't try to cook a chicken by shoving it back into an egg. Questions? Do I have 2 minutes for questions, maybe?
No, you actually have 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, I still have 5 minutes even though I went over it?
Well, because we're going to have a shorter transition between
Oh,
the
okay.
slides.
That's fine. All right, 5 minutes. Marcus.
So I'm wondering a little bit, because I've been fairly agnostic about distributed morphology myself. So the split between production and comprehension, you say that in production there's never really any problems with ambiguity. I'm wondering how, if you have any ideas on how distributed morphology might have trouble handling something like presumptive pronouns and parasitic gaps. So John told what did John tell his mother to price compare before she bought it? Where some people have to have a presumptive pronoun there, and some people it's very optional, and some people don't like it.
So how does distributed morphology deal with optionality?
With optionality and with, it's almost like they sort of reach an ambiguity by the time they get to the end of the sentence and they have to save the sentence by putting a pronoun.
I see what you're saying. So in the course of producing a sentence, they're not sure. They know the proposition they're going to express, but the actual surface structure,
Right.
I wouldn't say that it's ambiguous. I would say that they're choosing between different structures, but they're expressing the same proposition. I don't think there's really a competition between structures there. It's just which structure feels right now when you're trying, because I mean, obviously you can say the boy was bit by the dog or the dog bit the boy. I don't think there's ambiguity between those as you're producing them. You're just deciding which one you want to emphasize, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Miles?
Quick question, this is really kind of, almost kind of tangent, but on the hang-hung thing, you know, it could be lexical priming, but you know, if you look at it though, you know, it could just be priming due to phonetics, right? So, you know, jump is at the beginning of jumped too. So, you know, hang, of course, you know, may prime hang, but hung might not prime hang because it's just not phonetically the same in the base.
Okay, but no, that actually is an excellent point. It could, because we have that whole form of jump
Right.
in jumped. So the word jump has already been there, whereas hang and hung actually have different sounds, so it could be some sort of phonological priming. And I would have to go back and look at the stimuli they used, but I think they used forms like that inflect by, wait. I guess the way you would want to look at that is find cases where the regular and irregular past tense form are identical. Cut and cut.
Hit.
Hit and hit, yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
But then you'd have to do it in context.
Right.
Exactly, you'd have to do it in context, so you'd have to
That's
have a more sophisticated study. But you're right that that's a possible explanation. Mohammed?
I was thinking about could you reach this conclusion between comprehension and production if you analyze miscomprehension? So if somebody says something and then you look at their reaction, which is the miscomprehension, misunderstanding, would that give you a window to understand the relationship between?
You mean when you mishear something that somebody says?
Not misunderstand, because between production, you say something.
Misunderstand is like sort of what they meant to say. Yeah, I mean, that certainly happens. I mean, it certainly happens in, you know, L2 context, but it happens probably in L1 context too. So yeah, I mean, as the speech signal is coming in, or even as you're reading, you can misread a sentence or misunderstand what is being said by the sentence. There probably are competing structures there. You know, as words are coming in, we're trying to build a structure, presumably, with very limited data. I mean, we don't wait until the entire sentence is over and then start processing it. We process it sort of on the fly, so there's competing structures going on. Anybody else?
I guess sort of quickly on that, I think there have been studies done on things like that where you get differences between I never met a man taller than my mother and I never met a taller man than my mother, where the second one is semantically impossible unless your mother is a man, but then you might be able to get some interesting misconceptions there.
Yeah, that is, yeah, absolutely. I should look into that. Anybody else? Thank you very much.